This is OTR FM, part of the IOM Radio Network.
Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only No BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Joining me today to share the stories behind his 10 best spiritual books is distinguished emeritus professor in mythological studies at California's Pacifica Graduate University, Dennis Patrick Slattery, whose fields of interest cover the mythopoetic imagination. This is a mouthful. The mythopoetic imagination, depth and archetypal psychology, creativity, metaphor, theories of myth, and writing, and riding his Harley-Davidson motorbike through the country roads of Texas and painting mythic themes in watercolor and acrylics. Dennis Patrick Slattery, welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. It's just a real honor and a joy to be here with you today. And thank God for Zoom that makes the world smaller when we want to connect. So thank you.
Well, it certainly helped a lot of people connect over the last few years when they really needed that opportunity. Yeah. And it's good to have you, Dennis. And I think that when, by the time we're finished, our viewers will be glad you were with us too, because yours is one of the most interesting stories I've heard in a long time. So let's just start by saying that as the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 32 volumes, 7 of which are poetry and 1 of which is a novel, and a presenter of international writing retreats and workshops on exploring one's personal myth through the works of Joseph Campbell and C.G. Jung's Red Book. I guess we shouldn't be surprised to hear that your library encompasses over 6,500 books, some of which you describe as your best friends. So how did you cope with having to choose only 10?
This was a painful ordeal. It was exciting, but it was painful because I'll confess something here. I made up a list and then I lost it. I put it in a folder somewhere and it just got away from me. And sometimes my memory just will not retrieve it. So I made up another list. And that's the one I sent you. Then, looking for another folder in my study, I found the original list. And there were several that were different. And I thought then, maybe Sandy will accept a revision. And then I said, no, I'm going to stay with these 10. But Sandy, when we finish today, if I turned with my tablet and said, okay, what are the 10 best books for you today? They would be different. Not all, but some, because there's this echo chamber of other titles that said, why don't you choose me? You know I had a big effect on you, and they're absolutely right. But 10 is 10, and so here we are.
Here we are, yeah. Exactly. And many people say the same thing, that, ask me in a year's time and it might be completely different. And I mean, it's interesting because you speak as if you have a real relationship with books, and you do. You say that they're your best friends and they speak to you and you speak to them.
Yes. And I love being surrounded by them. I'm in my study. I was going to change locations in the house, and I thought, no, this is the room that I enter between 4:15 and 4:30, 7 days in the morning, 7 days a week. And This is my nest. This is my chapel. I have a little altar on the other side of the computer that has stones and pebbles from different parts of the world. I have a stone from the Terezin ghetto when Sandy and I visited north of Prague, pieces of soil from Ireland. So it's really a memento room. And then, of course, all the memories that are on the shelves. And I'm finding at my age that some of them are calling me to be reread. And I find rereading a whole other dimension of a relationship with a book. And I was privileged at Pacifica for all of those years to reread and reteach Dante and Melville and Toni Morrison and others. And there's some amazing deepening process that takes place in the act of rereading. And then, Sandy, to teach it, which then opens it up to the audience of the classroom, in which each individual student has his or her own mythos that they bring to the work. And so I joke with my students in the epic class. I said, I've taught Moby Dick for 20 years, and the same white whale has never breached twice. It's always a different white whale because the group in the room is different. And so the work, these beautiful literary classics, stretch or elongate to serve the group that's reading it now. And I find that to be a miraculous aspect of the communal imagination. And then as each student speaks, and I love asking them to read passages aloud because that's where the work becomes much more animated. And I love reading passages aloud. So the other level here is being read to. I mean, reading is one thing, but being read to, I find a joy. And of course, it's got all resonances from our younger ages when our parents may have read us fairy tales or passages from the Bible. It almost didn't matter. It's just that being read to opens the ears up in a way that reading silently doesn't happen.
Sounds like a cushy job. I mean, you get to do exactly what you love. You get to read the books. You then get to hear the books. Then you get to talk about the books.
Yes. Yeah.
And you get paid for it.
And you get paid for it. Yeah. You've just opened the secret box. You've got it. Yeah. And I think on my best days, I think, you know what? I think I have discovered the Grail, but I don't want to maybe let too many people know about it.
No.
But that whole experience of learning through reading and watching a work change in me and change students, transform them, is nothing short of miraculous, I have found.
Yeah. I don't know how anybody could not want to read.
I can't either.
No. Okay. Well, let's move through your list. And the very first book on your list you read when you were a junior in high school, and there were several reasons why it delighted you. The book is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, published in 1951, and you read it in 1962. So tell us about some of the things that delighted you about this book.
Yes, and I want to ask you something, if this would be okay. I went through all 10 and chose one sentence from each one, and I'm wondering if I could read that sentence at the beginning of our conversation for each text.
Absolutely.
So here's my Salinger, and this is Holden Caulfield. I like Jesus and all, but I don't care too much for most of the other stuff in the Bible. Now that line captures some of the attitude that Holden carries throughout that first person narrative that really resonated with me at that time in my life, and with my brothers, being on a pretty consistent level, being traumatized by my father's alcoholism and his violence in the household. And reading became a way to escape that. When I read Salinger's book, I thought, here is a kindred soul that understands rage, understands being on the outside or being on the margin. And when I saw how often he used the F word, it endeared him to me. I thought, I like this guy. He's sassy. He's coarse. He's cynical, and he has a good heart. Because one of his goals in life is to go around the world, into bathrooms, into stalls, into subways, and erase every FU that's been written on bathroom walls, subways, streets. And I thought at the time, there's something noble about this cynical kind of isolato that made me identify with that kind of ethos that in the face of dysfunction, he was trying to create a better world around eliminating one word, which I just thought was so fantastic. And I think it was the first work I ever read that struck something deep in me. I hadn't read anything before it that had that kind of passion about being and then reflecting on it with his flaws and with his virtues. And so I found Holden Caulfield to be a fabulous analogy to who I was at that age, terrified to go home and be home on the weekends and find other places to hide out. So there was a solace, I think, in that work. And I still have my high school copy up on the shelf on the other side of this computer. And I made sure that it came with us, Sandy and I, when we moved from Texas to Santa Barbara and then back here a number of years ago. Yeah, so he's an old friend, one of the oldest.
And how old were you when you read it? You said you were in high school.
Yeah, I think I was 16. I was a junior in high school. Yeah, sophomore or junior. And it was when my father was full throttle in his rage. And on reflection, and this takes me to the last of the 10 books, in his shame. And being traumatized, as anyone listening knows, is to invoke shame. Holden Caulfield helped me on an unconscious level because I couldn't articulate it. I didn't have the psychological wherewithal, but I knew he was healing something in me that I've learned to appreciate over the decades. Yeah.
And that's, a very impressionable, it's a very deep and powerful age. The things that happen to us around then stay with us for life.
Yes. Yeah. To your point, I think in retrospect, which is where I understand it, I think it's when I fell in love with literature and thought, I want literature to be part of my life in some form. And I can't grasp it yet, but it was that deep felt sense that my destiny had to include a poetics, mythopoetic sensibility, because I thought it would be the only place that I could be nurtured along those lines. And it's been true. As I look back over 6 decades, 5.5 decades, it's been true. So something pivotal happened then that I didn't know. And maybe we don't know until our destiny begins to unfold. And then we look back and say, that was a moment, and I can see it now.
Mm.
And that's quite a revelation, for
Yes.
any of us to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Books as therapy.
Books as therapy. Beautifully said. Yes.
Yeah. So book number 2, you say, is not only a masterpiece, but also one of the most spiritual you've ever read. And not many people would necessarily connect that with Moby Dick or
Right.
The Whale by
Yes.
Herman Melville. So tell
Yes.
us about that. Why do you think it was spiritual?
The first line, or the line that I want to share, this is Ishmael towards the end of the first chapter, called Loomings. And he writes, "The great floodgates of the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, 2 and 2 there floated into my inmost soul endless processions of the whale, and midmost of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air." And, Sandy, when I read, I don't know at what rereading it came to me, that Ishmael wants to go to sea. Now, we can spell that S-E-A, and we can also spell it S-E-E. So I think he's on a vision quest from the first page, and he's doing it. He's making this move off the land, which has suffocated him, because he says, the only alternative I can see from not using pistol and ball, because he's suicidal, is to go to sea. And so it's like it begins in a kind of via negativa. And it begins, I think, also like Dante's poem, which we'll speak about in a bit. It's the dark night of the soul. Dante will write about La Selva Oscura, the dark wood. I think that's where Ishmael is at the beginning. And, I've thought of doing this and haven't done it, is to read or reread The Dark Night of the Soul by John of the Cross, along with Ishmael's Quest. I think that they will connect with one another on multiple levels. And the other thing that Ishmael is hungry for is communitas. He wants to connect with other human beings and to find in their stories parts of his own story. And I find it, we could speak further about his name and the beginning of that work, where he instructs us, call me Ishmael. Now, what's so interesting about those 3 words is when you say them aloud, call me Ishmael, then we, the reader, are Ishmael. I think it's one of the most brilliant beginnings of a literary work we've ever seen, because we're asked to participate with our own narrative right from the get-go. And to do that for the next 560 some pages and 135 chapters. Now, that work came along after a friend and I had grown, like Ishmael, discontented with our successes, with our comfortable lives. We were both studying at a community college in downtown Cleveland, the first community college in the state of Ohio. And we shipped on board a German freighter out of the Cleveland docks. And we hired on as mess hands. We cleaned the bathrooms. We served the German merchant marine men who were satisfying their military service on the merchant marine ship. And we spent 21 days from the time we left Cleveland Harbor to a docking at Bremerhaven port in Germany. And then we hitchhiked through countries to Ireland and spent time with my friend Denny's relatives. And then we had to come home because the draft was after him more than me, but I knew my time was up. This is 1966. Yeah. When I came home, and I sat aft on the ship each evening and wrote in a journal. And it's the first time I've kept a journal. I was 20 at the time. And when I came home, I typed that journal up to about 90, 95 pages. And I don't want to even, I'm not sure I want to even say about what happened to that journal, but this is the age where there was just carbon paper. Yeah, that's the best you could do for a copy. I want to say it this way. I knew that I had had a transformative experience, but it had no shape and it had no form. So I began reading other classics of sea stories, Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, Huck Finn, any work that would put me back on the water. I read Melville's White Jacket, Billy Budd, and then I tackled Moby Dick, which I had left behind. And that work hit me as a spiritual memoir that so connected with my 20-year-old imagination that I thought, this is the quest. I didn't have that language either until I started reading Joseph Campbell and more mythology and learning about the Grail quest. And so what I'm putting together here as I speak is the power of analogy to shape one's own narrative by means of a narrative that one has stepped into and looked around and say, well, let's see if we can put the particulars of this this plot together. And it kept resonating. And I know you've heard this word from many of us who have been on the show, how Echo, that wonderful figure in Greek mythology, kind of gives us back to ourselves when we reflect and we listen and we hear shards of our own narrative slipping through the cracks of the story that we're reading. And Moby Dick did that for me as one of the top 4 or 5 literary works that I've carried with me, and I've even written a book about it and articles on it. And this is the other thing I want to just mention, on not as an aside, but when these works really get under one's skin, I think that there is an impulse to write about it. And so when I read these works, I can't read them and underline them. I read and then write, maybe passages turns into something else. When I'm through with it, I mean, I have so many folders on Moby Dick, it's almost embarrassing, because each time I go through it, something else opens, which is a testimony, I think, Sandy, to the organic quality of these literary classics. They stretch and they do what is needed to be done to accommodate where the reader is at that point in his or her development. And so, and just the last point here, I'm still astonished that Melville was only 32 when he published that work. It's at 32, he was a wise sage. Aside from his personal life and his challenges with the money and making ends meet, there was some wise sage in him that really outlined for us the myth of America in the middle of the 19th century as it was moving into an industrial age. And, so every time I reread it, I'm completely astonished again at its depth.
I find it very interesting that you chose to write about them. That's obviously your way of processing the information,
Absolutely.
processing the experience, isn't it?
Absolutely. When I'm reading in the morning meditatively, maybe the poetry of Rumi or another work, I have to have pen, and I am obsessed with these yellow pads with the margin. Let's see if I can do this over here, so that I can write my notes here as I write passages maybe from the work here. And in a sense, I'm recreating the work according to Slattery's myth.
Yeah.
And when students, when people realize that their myth is being invoked in the reading, then the whole reading process and writing as one reads, I think, becomes very exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely. I agree with you. So, book number 3, and you say that this is the book that changed your life trajectory, Crime and Punishment, Fyodor Dostoevsky, published in 1866, and I think you read it in 1966. Century later.
A century later. Yes. The Irishman met the Russian. Yeah, that's right. Well, I had just transferred down to Kent State as a junior after 2 years of school in Cleveland, one at Cleveland State University, and prior to that, Cuyahoga Community College, from where my friend and I shipped out on the German freighter. And a good friend, and we still stay in contact, used to invite me down to Kent on the weekends to party around with him and his buddy and just to hang out. So when it came time that I saw that I could swing financially transferring, I chose Kent. And this friend was also a mentor. I don't know if he knew that, probably not, but he would suggest different works to me. And one of them that he gave me was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I think I'd heard Dostoevsky's name, but I'd never read anything by him. And when I started at Kent, this is in September of 66, I rented a study carrel in the main library, and it was a pittance, really, for the academic year. And I used to hang out there often, rather than going back to the room in the rent house that I was in just across the street from the entrance to the campus. So one afternoon, I had the Crime and Punishment with me, and I had some other reading for courses. I started to read it. And Sandy, I stopped going to class for a full week. I was like Raskolnikov, a kind of a madman, obsessed. I couldn't fathom what I was reading. And the first 66 pages of this 350-page work are about this young, isolated college student planning to murder a pawnbroker, and then to give all of what she had in her cases, in her trunks, under her bed, to the poor. A very altruistic move. And then he executes it. And it it immediately becomes chaotic. His perfectly planned murder winds up forcing him to murder 3 people, not just the pawnbroker. I think this is the pivot that started with Salinger, and then I acted on it. I was majoring in experimental psychology at Kent, and quite honestly, bored with it. When I read and finished Crime and Punishment, I realized there was more psychology on one page of that novel than an entire course. At the time, I did not know specific schools of psychology. So I stepped into what Kent State was known for and what they offered. There was no other form of psychology there. And when I finished it, I took it and I walked up to the registrar's office and I shifted my major from psychology to literature. And I want to capture a sense that it wasn't something thought through. It was an embodied impulse that said, change your destiny now. And it was yielding. I learned later that Joseph Campbell lays out the hero's quest that begins with hearing a call, then heeding or refusing the call. And in Hero with a Thousand Faces, he gives several pages over to refusing the call. And then if one yields to the call, one gives oneself over to something bigger than they are. Not as big. It has to be bigger. Otherwise, it's not a real calling. As Campbell writes, and as I agree with. So that redemptive story, and Raskolnikov is redeemed by an 18-year-old prostitute by the name of Sonia Marmeladov, who sells her body for money to buy food so that she can feed her consumptive mother, her alcoholic father, and her young brother and sister. And it is she, Sonia, who recites by heart the story of the raising of Lazarus. And then when she finishes it, and this is such a beautiful mirror, he recognizes he has to turn himself in if he's going to be resurrected as a human being. And so it reconnected me to my own faith when I read that, and that Sonia knew there was no convincing this young murderer to turn himself in, but she knew a story that could give him a blueprint, a template by which to gauge his future. And then when he confesses and he's put into prison, I'm not sure for how long, but not for a life sentence, she visits him all the time. And the novel ends with the idea that they will probably marry when he gets out. So that powerful story, again, of sinking into the abyss of an obsession based on wrong thinking. He has a kind of Napoleon complex about him. But when he steps in the sticky blood of Elyona Filipovna, who he murders, that sticky blood pulls him down to the reality that he has just created. And from then on, it's fear that motivates him. And he never does gather the stuff and distribute it. It's when the ideal, fabricated, meets the reality of flesh and blood that it collapses around him. So that dramatic power, and Dostoevsky, I think, is one of the most psychological of writers of any culture that we've had. And there, of course, there are many others. And Sandy, many years later, I wound up writing my dissertation, not on Crime and Punishment, but on the novel that he wrote subsequently to that, entitled The Idiot. And so my first book is a book on a book of Dostoevsky. Yeah. It's so interesting to watch how our lives keep meshing with other parts of our lives. And, paying attention to that is really an adventure.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. Book number 4, Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung.
And
published in 1961.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry. And here's my line. But dreams like this, Jung writes, and my actual experiences of the unconscious taught me that such contents are not dead, outmoded forms, but belong to our living being. And this was a book. It's so interesting how all of us, I believe, have people that come into our lives, and maybe friends for decades, maybe friends for a while, and then things change, who suggest books to us. Now, of course, movies too, and music, but we're focusing on the reading here. And this book was recommended to me by a fellow by the name of David Jones, who, with his family, shared another apartment in this large house in Kent. And Sandy and I, who had been married a short time, lived in another apartment. And Dave and I would get together, and we both found that we loved Jung, and Jung was new to me, really because of David. And he said, there's 17, 18 volumes of Jung, but the thing that I think you should read is Jung writing in his 83rd year, in which he says, in the prologue, he says, I want to tell my personal myth. I can only make direct statements, only tell stories. And so Memories, Dreams, Reflections is his memoir, but it's more than a memoir. It's really him tracking the psychic development that was both his destiny and his strength. What he was good at found the destiny that allowed him to build it and become the father of analytical psychology. When I read it, and I've reread it twice since the first reading, I noticed how psychology and a kind of poetic way of speaking about one's life are not separate categories, but they're of a piece. And that how memory is in part our capacity to imagine, and our imagination is in part our capacity to remember. So when those two came together for me, memory and imagination, in a prose style that was free of jargon and psychological concepts, although Jung makes a point of telling when he discovered this idea about the psyche. So I found, again, and I use the word resonance for all of these 10 works. Resonance brings back echo. And I think, well, the myth of Narcissus and Echo is my favorite myth of all the Greek myths. And part of me thinks that Narcissus and Echo myth is the myth of myths themselves that combines both reflection and the echoic, the resonance of things. So it's both visual and audio. And to back up to Ishmael, he cites that myth in the first chapter of Moby Dick, which I sense is the myth we're to read that. Maybe it's the myth we're to use to read all the books that we read, that is both part reflective and part echoic. And so the body is implicated in its senses. So Jung's writing about his life from his 83rd year resonated in me the desire to start thinking about telling my own story in what I write and what I read. And I wind up doing that in the last book that we'll mention today, the 10th book. When I had that survey, that deep, rich survey of Jung's, in which he elevates the power of psychological images as a way to understand something, not conceptual language, but a deep, and I'm going to use the word again, a deep mythopoetic image. The image carries the narrative. If one can be patient with it and let it reveal itself or disclose itself. So Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflection was a magnificent disclosure of who he was, and it, I felt, was the preface to my reading for the next decades, as much of the collected works as possible. And it's the work that I would recommend to anybody who doesn't know Jung but wants to enter his world. Is start with his memoir.
You know, I really do believe that we all, when we reach a certain age, should write our own memoir. Not just because I think it's a fabulous thing to leave to your children and grandchildren, because they don't know who you are. They only know their experience of you. And I
Yes.
think it would be so helpful to them. But also, it's a wonderful opportunity to make sense of everything.
You're touching on something that is so important to me, and I know to others listening, viewing, is writing itself is an organizing principle, or carries an organizing principle within it. And that's why I think all writing is in some dimension mythic. Because for me, the beauty of myths is how they help us shape and order parts of our lives that may not be very coherent into a coherent form, where there's maybe a hidden confluence when we feel we're just disparate and scattered. So the reading with the writing, leading to what you just said, I think people who write their memoirs come to an understanding of who they are in a way they did not know, or they knew partially before the writing.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to book number 5, which is one that you've returned to many times over the years. And you say that you regard this as one of your true norths. It's Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander by Thomas Merton.
Yes.
Published around about 1966, I think, but you read it in 71.
I read it in 71. And there's such an interesting story about how I came into contact with Merton. At the time, Sandy and I had moved out of Kent, where she and I had both taught at different schools, up to Lorain, Ohio, where I began teaching at a Catholic high school, and she began teaching history and math at St. Peter's, which was a junior high school. And I really became friends with the chaplain of the high school, Bill Snyder. And I used to serve mass as a fourth, fifth, sixth grader, and and that was the days when the mass was in Latin, so knew the full Latin mass by heart. But I always loved serving. Something about being in that space, and the ritual of the mass. So I asked Bill Snyder, "Do you ever need an altar boy?" And he said, "Yeah, anytime you want. I say this 8:00 mass. You want to come in and pick that old habit up?" And I said, "Absolutely." So I did. And after one mass, I said to him, because I so enjoyed as a senior in high school, making a retreat at the diocesan retreat house next to the high school. All of us, all male Catholic high school, were asked to, actually they insisted towards the end of the senior year. And it was 3 days from Friday afternoon till Sunday noon. And I was fortunate that they gave me my own room. And I love that monastic sense of things and having my own space. This was new because we lived in a small house, and it was we were doubled up. So I asked Bill, where could I make a retreat? And he didn't hesitate for a second. He said, you need to go down to Gethsemane Monastery in Trappist, Kentucky, which is about 60 miles south and east of Lexington. Yeah. And so when I finished the first year of teaching high school, and I had treated myself to a new BMW motorcycle, I think it was a 71 motorcycle, and I'd been riding a BSA motorcycle before then. I loaded it up in first week in June, and I had called ahead and made a reservation. And I drove the 450 miles down to Gethsemane. And the monks were just terrific. They let me park it inside the post office, which was a very large complex. And I would go down and fetch stuff out and got settled in a room. Went down to the library in the basement. And there's this glass case. And there's letters from Jacques Maritain to this guy, Merton, and letters from Flannery O'Connor to Merton, and other people from around the world. And I'm wondering, who is this Merton? And I saw on the shelves that there were several shelves of multiple copies of his writing. And a brother came down and he introduced himself, and I said, I'm my first time here and I'm just learning the ropes. Who is this Thomas Merton? And he said, well, would you like to meet him? I said, yes, thinking that we were going to meet him somewhere on. So he took me outside and around to a little grassy area where there were about 12 crosses. And he said, right over here is Father Lewis. Thomas Merton was his stage name, but he was Father Lewis, the Benedictine monk. And I said, this, okay, when did this happen? He said he died in 1968. And I said, did you know him well? He said, well, I was his personal secretary for 20 years. So I learned that I was talking to Brother Patrick Hart, and developed a friendship with him because I made several retreats, maybe 12, over a 20-year period. I would either ride up from Texas after we moved, or I think I did one more trip from Ohio. But Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, the title intrigued me. And so I didn't ask Brother Patrick, what should I start reading of Merton's? And he didn't offer anything, which I thank him for that. He let me just, what work is speaking to you? Well, that title really spoke to me. So I began reading it and subsequently began listening to tapes that he would give to the novices, because he was a marvelous mentor for them. But I realized that the monastic world did not have to be a sheltered enclosure, because Merton was one of the most cosmopolitan writers in the Catholic Church that I'd ever heard of. And he was not afraid to write about the shape of democracy or its demise, racism, sexism. He was so far ahead, like Melville. He was so far ahead of his time. And I thought, now this is a kind of Catholicism, Catholic writing that is really in the world. It's not in solitude, but Merton's writing in solitude allowed him to be connected to the world like few religious that I'd ever read before. So that was the draw. And Sandy, the other piece that I think fits here is that I was already beginning to move towards an interdisciplinary imagination. In other words, not to get caught in one discipline to the exclusion of others, but to let disciplines speak to one another. And subsequently, when I applied and was accepted at the University of Dallas in their Institute of Philosophic Studies, they insisted that each of us major in a discipline and minor in a discipline. And then once each spring, all of the students in 5 different disciplines came together and took a course together. One year was Marshall McLuhan. Another year was Hans-Georg Gadamer. They would get these big names who themselves had an interdisciplinary imagination. I mean, it was just, but what I realized was appealing to me with Merton is he had that interdisciplinary way of looking at things. And he was one heck of a poet. And he wrote about poetry as well as wrote poetry. I mean, just the volume of his poetry is an amazing, thick, and wonderful meditative experience. And I've read in mine, not cover to cover. But he also got me thinking about writing poetry, which I had never thought of before. And what I was asking myself, well, what is his subject matter for his poetry? Well, my gosh, it's his own life. It's what he's struggling with. It's what he's not sure of. It's what he may be doubting in his faith. And I thought, boy, here's another Holden Caulfield that I can relate to. Again, an edgy, kind of on the margins, but writing right to the center of things. So it was as much his style as it was his content. And he couched Catholic theology in a context that was truly ecumenical and, for my interest, psychological. Yeah. So that's what inspired me, and I continue to read him to this day. Yeah.
So before we get to book number 6, I do have to say that we are going to have to speed it up a little bit, because as fascinating as this is, we only have so much time, and I do want to make sure that we get through the entire list. So the next book is The Odyssey by Homer. I had no idea when it was published. And I don't know that if anybody does, but you read it in 1976, and you've taught it for many, many years as another form of a spiritual journey.
Yes. And I think somewhere around 850 BCE is one of the pockets of time that scholars believe that it was crafted. I think the epic tradition was opened to me by the Odyssey. and the Iliad. But the Odyssey, because of its magical way of thinking about home and about homecoming and about being at home and the place of violence and wars that shatter one's sense of being at home, that wars kind of orphan all the warriors and traumatize them. So that whole sense of being at a place where one can feel safe is just yanked out from under them. So I think that was the biggest appeal. And I love James Hillman, the psychologist, saying it's fine to have the Gideon Bible in hotels and motels across the world, across the country, but why don't we have a copy of Homer's Odyssey at the same time in the same drawer? Because most people traveling in hotels and motels are on their way away from home or maybe starting to head back home. So that archetype of the home, and I know my own background in a dysfunctional home certainly played a part in my attraction. The Odyssey was like a magnet to me. And it showed us where the masculine and the feminine in cooperation can create a world that is so much more full than either could do on their own. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that I think people are just beginning to remember.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, number 7, The Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri, published in 1320. These books, I mean, wouldn't you just love it if one of your books lasted as long?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, even a sentence. I'd be happy with it. Exactly. And here's my Dante. I know I skipped some of these, but I'm also now much more conscious of our time. Dante writes this in Purgatorio. For when your longings center on things such that sharing them apportions less to each, then envy stirs the bellows of your sighs. I mean, what a psychological understanding of how envy operates. It's when you want to apportion less to others, where the spirit of generosity is to apportion more to others. I think, Sandy, that first of all, I had a magnificent professor at the University of Dallas by the name of Ray DiLorenzo, who opened this epic up to us as grad students. I think also often the transport vehicle of where these works are introduced to one is as important as the work itself. And Ray was a magnificent transport vehicle. And I'm stealing that. That's a term of Joseph Campbell's when he speaks about metaphor. I love the idea of a soul remembering when he was lost in a dark wood and completely despondent with no direction in his life. And this is a deep archetype that runs through world literature on so many levels. But I had learned enough of Jung to realize that Dante's poem was perhaps the subtlest, most nuanced expression of what Jung called the individuation process. That is, that process by which one becomes most fully who one can be. And so reading Dante through that mythic lens of Jung's individuation process showed me that we can be lost in a dark wood as the place of awakening, becoming conscious, maybe for the first time. I think people are lost in the dark wood when they're 26 and when they're 74. The chronology is not as important as the psychology of feeling lost in the world without a direction. The other thing it taught me, and Homer did as well, is, and Dostoevsky, how important paying attention to when a mentor or a guide suddenly appears in the terrain of your life, and to be willing and open and porous enough to listen, that maybe somebody is being given as a gift to you in order to move you at least in the right direction. And of course, Dante has several guides like that. But the relationship between an other who can, like an elder, read where you are and have an intuitive understanding of the direction that might be most fruitful for you is why I find and found teaching this work so rich and valuable. Yeah.
Well said. Book number 8, Beloved, by Toni Morrison.
Yes, I heard her interviewed in 1988. The book had won the Pulitzer, was not on the bookshelves of stores yet, and she was interviewed by a British fellow, I forget his name, who had his own show, would have people in as you do. And I think the style of her writing was as attractive to me as the content. And as I read it and taught it and reread it and retaught it, I thought this is the most powerful expression and exploration of shame that I ever read. And the figure of baby Suggs Holy, who is the crone who holds the people together when they are feeling enslaved by their own enslavement in the way they think about themselves. And when she gathers them at one point in the novel and boosts their sense of integrity. And here's what she said. This is my one sentence. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine. Well, when I read that line for the first time, I thought this is a magnificent study of the imagination itself and the way that we self-image ourselves into a corner and into incarceration, or how we can imagine ourselves into a sense of liberation. And so the mindfulness that baby Suggs carried as an elder for the people was their path to self-integrity. And when she convinces them how you remember yourself is the self that you're going to be living out right now. So that whole trajectory, once again, of memory and imagination, playing themselves off into creating a new reality was just terribly exciting for me. And there was a part of me that thought, well, you're a white male teaching this work. And then I really had to let that notion go, realizing this is a novel for everybody who has felt in any way brutalized, traumatized, dismembered, or fractured. It goes beyond race, but race is the touchstone. And when she was researching it and came on Margaret Garner, who did historically try to murder her children so as to spare them from a life of slavery, she stopped the research because, as she has written, any more information about this historical figure would cause me not to be able to write this novel. So it opened up a really interesting tension between how much do you research something before killing it off, and how much do you not research it so the imagination has free play. It can move around. It's supple, if you will. Yeah. So those are just a couple of the ideas that and the feelings, and her playing with style, writing style was just, I've never read anything like it. And for me, it's her Moby Dick. It's where everything gathered. And I've read her works prior to Beloved and after, but this is the mothership for, I think, for her imagination. Yeah.
Book number 9, No Time to Lose, A Timely Guide to the Way of the Bodhisattva by Pema Chodron.
Yes. This was, I think, the second work of hers that I read. It was recommended by a good colleague and friend at Pacifica, who teaches a course in Buddhism and a course in Hinduism, Patrick Mahaffey. He said, take this up because Pema Chodron, is working off of stanzas of a large spiritual epic from the 8th century by a bodhisattva, Shantideva. And he said, I think you would enjoy. Here she is as an American-born Buddhist who created the first Buddhist monastery, I think in Nova Scotia, for Westerners. And what a marvelous and original creation she performed. So it's a thick book. And I read Shantideva's poem first. Then I went back and picked up this. And again, Sandy, it's that constant compass of mine that keeps coming back to where psychology, mythology, poetry constellate, they're speaking to one another. And so this was a marvelous way to read what I found to be a difficult spiritual epic, because so compressed. And I didn't have the knowledge of Buddhism to move through it on my own. So I needed a guide. So this is Pema Chodron became my Beatrice, as Beatrice did for Dante, to get him through the hardest part of the pilgrimage that he was on. And since then, I've read 6 or 8 of her works. This is the one that I return to reread most often. And prior to today, I was checking my 3-ring binder, and I have 65 pages of handwritten notes off of this volume. And so that's what I read in the morning, but I have the work next to me so that I can go back to a passage. And yeah, I think I gauge the influence of a work on me by how many pages of handwritten that I've accumulated. So I have 2 3-ring binders of Pema Chodron notes from many of her works. Yeah.
Well, book number 10, your final book, was originally published in 2004 under the title Grace in the Desert, Awakening to the Gifts of Monastic Life. And it was revised when the rights reverted back to its author and published under the title A Pilgrimage Beyond Belief, Spiritual Journeys Through Christian and Buddhist Monasteries of the American West. That author was you.
Yes.
Why is this book on your list?
Yeah, it's a good question too, because this one gave me trouble. Here's a sentence from it. The one authentic desire I felt and believed in was to explore this spiritual life by retreating from as many distractions and comfortable impediments as possible in order to see what arises within a cauldron of scarcity, because that's what I was living in, a cauldron of scarcity, simplicity, and as well as I could cultivate it, serenity. The major revelation, and I did not make this 3.5-month pilgrimage, which was my first sabbatical ever in academia, given to me by Pacifica. I better not go there, take me off. This pilgrimage came about because I was looking for a book on Ireland, because Sandy and I were going to tour Ireland. And when I pulled the book on Ireland off the bookstore shelf, a book on monasteries and retreat centers stuck to it and landed on my foot. And I said to Sandy, I think I'm going to make another pilgrimage and we'll do Ireland next. And she was completely in agreement. What this turned out to be was that my father, who had been dead for 4 years, appeared to me at the second monastery in Napa Valley and was a presence. And he began to speak to me about his alcoholism. And it was so palpable that 2 days later, when I was to leave this monastery, I cleared the passenger seat of my Ford pickup truck, put everything in the back, and I had a lid to lock it all down. And he accompanied me for the next 3 months. And Tom Moore, who was just very gracious in writing a foreword, said the heartbeat of Dennis's book is reconciling with his alcoholic father. That's why, and I didn't know that that's what the book was about. I needed Tom. I needed a sharp, wise person to see. This was a pilgrimage towards reconciliation. And I did not have that in mind at all when I made the trip, and even when I wrote about it. But it was a presencing, Sandy, that I could not deny and not chalk up to a figment of the imagination. He was a palpable presence. And since then, the book was published first in 2000. Yeah. And then it was republished. I have conversations with both my mother and him regularly. And all of the acid, the animosity, because I realized that the level of shame that he lived in as an alcoholic was monstrous. Yeah. So it brought me to a sense of compassion about my father, and it also brought me to a sense of being more compassionate towards myself. Yes. And so it's really a miracle text. Yeah.
Shame is, I think, the secret epidemic.
Yeah.
Everybody knows shame, and
I agree.
Nobody talks about it.
No, it's really one of those hidden junctures that when opportunities come up and one does address it, it's like losing 40 pounds in an instant. There's a lightness that enters. This has been my experience, but I've also talked about shame with others. And it is one of the most self-alienating emotions that we can weaponize against ourselves. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. I would love it if somebody, I'm sure there've been many books written about shame, but if somebody could provide the definitive tool, whatever,
Yes.
To banish shame.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah. It's a destructive response to something that has been violently, and it doesn't have to be physical, verbal, just demeaning. It's like the carbuncle, the growth that comes up as a result of being treated less than one is. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot we could say about shame, but we're almost out of time now. I do want to ask you about your writing retreats, and you have the word writing as Riting. Why?
Yeah, it's very good. I'm playing, and the publisher I had to argue with a little bit to keep the word writing, because writing is a ritual. Writing is a ritual way of thinking about something, or a ritual way of imagining something. And when I do these writing retreats, I encourage people. I don't mandate it. Please write cursively. Just leave the laptop closed and see what a difference it is to drag a pen across paper, because the body gets more activated, I think, in cursive writing than in simply hitting the keys. And of course, and I don't know enough about handwriting analysis, but our character, our personhood is in the cursive handwriting. It's like a fingerprint, and it also slows things down. And I think it performs a kind of meditative role when participants are encouraged to write on this topic for 15 minutes, and to disabuse them that it's not about quantity and bulk. It's about the quality of it. And I even encourage them, don't start writing right away. Give it a minute, just settle in, and then just take the pen and bring your favorite journal. And it's amazing how many people keep journals, and it's never an issue, or it never comes up in conversation. But I think people, and I encourage those who don't keep a journal, try it for a week. Do 3 days out of 7, and write about anything that the memory brings up for you, or something taking place right now. Because as we were saying earlier, writing as ritual organizes and allows one to think more deeply than if the thoughts are just roiling around in the head and aren't fixed. Toni Morrison said at the when she spoke about the creation of Beloved, she said, there are certain topics that only artists can write about, because they engage in this is her language, in a fixing ceremony, that you fix it. Well, and I respect everything that she says about the creative process, but I think that she's onto something there about how writing is a ritual that fixes something, so it can be not imprisoned, but meditated upon. And you come back to it, and then maybe you add to it. I think it's part of why the 10th book is my own, because I return to it and read passages. And when I wrote it, I was in a very different space and time. So there's a quality of it being mine, but there's also another voice that's not mine. And that's part of the miracle, I think, of writing. Some other voice comes in. Yeah, it's miraculous for me.
Yes, it is. Every writer says there are those moments where they come out of that trance and they read what they've written and said, who wrote that?
Who wrote that? Yes.
Who wrote that?
Yeah, beautiful. I'm glad that that's a refrain that you see in other guests that you have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dennis, it's very clear. I mean, we've done many, many, many of these shows, and every single one of them is a delight and different. I don't think I've ever come across somebody who, I want to say, eats. I don't know why I want to say eats, but the way, your love of words, your love of writing, your love of poetry, your love of the imagination. I mean, clearly, this is what you do for a living, but it's so palpable. It's so distinctive. I don't think I've ever met anybody who seems to take such incredible joy. It's like eating a gourmet meal. That's how the feeling I get, when you find a book that you really love and resonate with, it's almost like you're taking it into yourself.
That means a lot, Sandy. Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you for witnessing me in that way. Yeah.
And thank you for sharing that with us, because it is a wonderful thing to witness.
It's been an honor.
It's been an honor for us, Patrick. Thank you. Sorry, Dennis Patrick Slattery. Thank you. So why do I want to call you Patrick? Is it the Irish?
It's Irish, and some of my students call me Patrick even to this day, and I'm fine because I love the middle name. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your 10 best spiritual books with the No BS Spiritual Book Club. I'm sure anybody who goes to the website, reads your list, reads your incredible descriptions, which, go into greater depth, I think, than we have been able to do here. Or anybody who watches this in the future will gain so much from them. Thank you. And different books, very powerful.
Yeah. And I just want to thank and acknowledge you for the way that you so gracefully orchestrate each one of us who comes on, because I've watched several of the others. So that acknowledgement is important for me to make about you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So if you want to know more about Dennis's work or his writing retreats, you can go to his website, dennispatrickslattery.com. And goodness, you can look through some, God knows, 30 plus volumes or more that he's edited, co-edited, co-authored, written, etc. So you can have a feast there. Before we close, I just want to say that as the spiritual book market becomes increasingly crowded, it is becoming much more challenging to sort the wheat from the chaff. And that is why we did launch the No BS Spiritual Book Club. So if you're looking for recommendations from authors, teachers, speakers, and others who've walked this path before you, check out our free 10 Best Spiritual Books archive at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com. where in addition to viewing previous episodes in this video series, you can also add your name to our Save MySpace list to get last-minute reminders of upcoming episodes. Nice. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best Spiritual Books interview. Till then, it's goodbye from me.
Thank you.